This is the fun part for understanding the American Revolution. How revolutionary was it? What's the function of it? Revolutionary for who? World turns upside down? For who? A war for independence? For who? And I'm not just sort of that to be problematic in an audience. Answer the question. For who? I saw a T-shirt yesterday that was 250 years of liberty. For who? So if we want to say 250 years of white liberty, of white male liberty, let's not use that in terms of our framing and our storytelling. For who?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight at the West End Museum. And I also want to thank the West End Museum for jumping in at the last second and helping us out. It is 92 degrees inside Old North Church right now, so you are happy to be here. If tonight is your first time at the West End Museum, I want you to come back. The West End Museum celebrates the legacy of a community that resisted the destruction of its neighborhood. And unfortunately, they lost the fight, but their story is told here, and it's an important story to hear. My name is Nikki Stewart, and I'm the executive director of Old North Illuminated. We are the secular nonprofit that manages education, tourism, and preservation at Old North Church. Now, when I read Tad's book, A Resistance History of the United States, I found many examples of what resistance looks like. And it prompted me to consider what causes someone to stand up and resist injustice. Where do we find our values? Where do we center our moral compass? And for many, I think that answer is their faith. Now, Old North Church is a National Historic Landmark, but it is also an active place of worship. It's a mission congregation of the Episcopal Diocese of Massachusetts. And we aren't in Old North tonight, but I want us to stay grounded in the role that religion plays in resistance, and especially the ways that the Episcopal Church leads by example. I'm sure all of us remember back in January, as ICE agents terrorized the Twin Cities, we saw faith leaders from all faiths come together and lead resistance literally in the streets. Rob Hirschfield, the Episcopal Bishop of New Hampshire, asked his clergy to get their affairs in order, to make sure they have their wills written, because it may be that now is no longer the time for statements, but for us, with our bodies, to stand between the powers of the world and the most vulnerable. A year earlier, Bishop Mary Ann Edgar Buddy gave the sermon at the inaugural prayer service at the National Cathedral in Washington. Directly addressing President Trump in the front row, she urged him to have mercy on those in our communities who are scared and vulnerable. And just last month, Bishop Julia Whitworth marched in Boston's Pride Parade with a t-shirt that read, "This bishop loves you." So Old North's history teaches us that resistance is fueled by courage, compassion, and the commitments we make to our neighbors. And now, tonight's special guest will give us the inspiration we need to actively shape our nation's next 250 years.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I know it's hot. I know it would have been nice to stay in your own houses with your own AC. I appreciate you all coming out to hear what we have to say to you tonight. I think it's important because, as I heard Tad say recently, this is actually the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, July 2nd, when it was actually submitted.
Well, the resolution for independence was passed today.
The resolution for independence was passed today.
And so this is when America became independent. July 4th is the passage of the Declaration, the statement, the representation of that. This is when it happened.
And I think that's a good indication of how throughout this book and throughout our conversation today, we're going to talk a little bit about how the story we know, the conventional story of the American Revolution, the conventional story of the United States of America, and the actual history diverge quite significantly. And why that's not always an accident. Why the things that we have learned are the things that we have been taught for a reason. and that the true history of the United States, a history that we might find more useful in our time, is not taught to us by design. So Dr. Stoermer says right off, I'm going to tell you something uncomfortable about American history, then spend the rest of this book telling you stories about it. Nearly every significant advance toward justice in American history came from people willing to disrupt, defy, or destroy abusive authority. And nearly every advance was systematically rolled back by mechanisms designed for precisely that purpose. This isn't the history you learned in school. It's what the evidence shows when you stop asking why the system didn't work better and start asking why it worked exactly as designed. This is a resistance history of the United States, a history of how people forced change against institutions built to prevent it, and how those institutions adapted to contain the changes resistors achieved. Now, one of the things you said in a reader's note at the beginning was that this is not a book you wanted to write, that you wanted to write an interesting story about abusive authority and resistance to it, not an urgent one. And so I want to begin our conversation by asking why this book is urgent now. And what took you from writing an interesting story to an urgent story? Why did you feel so compelled?
It's the moment that made it urgent, not me. When I was asked to write the book, it started off, and for those of you who have been with me for a long time, I wrote this book in the open. Right? And I sort of shared it in the open, we talked about it in the open, and we went through it in the open, that it was essentially supposed to be a very nice little volume that my publisher could go ahead and get in people's hands and sort of like maybe take it to the beach, maybe just put it on your shelf, and it would be fun. While I was working on the book I really wanted to write. And then when I started thinking deeply about what resistance meant, what abusive authority really was, focusing on my training and getting deep to the heart of it as a process and the context, but then our circumstances spun quickly. And I think for a lot of us in this make it make sense moment, it was that kind of question about how do these stories in fact not just make sense in their own moment, but what about them help us make sense of ours? And it was that question which became not just pertinent, but persistent, that actually drove my further consideration of the story.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that you're an academically trained historian. You teach at a university, you were trained at universities, and yet you often identify as a public historian now. For those of you who don't know, Dr. Stoermer has 140,000+ followers on Instagram.
640,000.
640,000 excuse me. And I can say I don't think I've seen 640,000 students in my classrooms, and I've been teaching a long time. But I wonder if you would tell us a little bit about what it means to you to be a public historian, like why you draw a distinction between an academic historian and a public historian. What is the key difference there? Yeah. What do you think that public historians do that academic historians don't do? And maybe vice versa as well.
Yeah. And it's great to be in a room of so many people who, again, have been with me in all of these kind of guises, right? Who understand me as an academic historian, Joyce, who who understand me as a public historian, one of my former students here at Harvard, Leah, teaching public history. That this idea that as historians, we all start from the same spot. We want to get it right. We want to get as close to it right as possible. Why things happened when they did the way they did, or in certain cases, why they didn't happen when they should have, to try to explain, stasis or change. Now, as an academic historian, when we work on that, what we try to do is we try to insert our sentence into our understanding of how other historians have interpreted it. It's the historiography. We try to go ahead and slide our interpretation, our understanding, into that conversation. A public historian pivots, starting from the same point, but pivots. How do we take that understanding and communicating it to broader audiences? How do we get out of the seminar room? How do we get out of talking to other historians? But part of that is not just understanding the methods that we use. Do we use digital media? Do we use films like you do such a great job with? I mean, how do we use books to do that? How do we, and that Jen does such a good job with, right? I mean, is that how do we go ahead and engage with, choose those methods that will reach all of these people? It's also, to me, understanding how those audiences understand their history. Our scholarly colleagues, we understand it by having a grasp of the historiography, what other historians have said about these things before us, what the scholarship is on that, what the sources are on that, and we understand how they came to their understanding of it so we can have that conversation. When we talk about the public, we need to understand how those people, how the people get their understanding of the past so that we can then start having that conversation. And that's through story. That's through narrative. That's through all of these means and mechanisms, whether it's, again, film and novels and narrative structures, that everybody mostly gains their understanding about the past and how it relates to themselves because of stories that other people tell to them, whether it's their grandparents or whether it's Ken Burns, it doesn't matter. It's a story. And so for us to be able to engage in public history, it's not just to understand the methods and means by which we reach broader audiences, but how those audiences come to understand that history so we can go to where they are. And so to me, that's what public history is about. It can be more complicated than you might think. It's not just being in a museum, but people who work in these venues understand that you've got to go to where people are to speak their language to understand why they're where they are. And for that, you've got to understand history as story, as narrative.
That's great, which raises a question for me. Which is, do you ever feel like you have to make concessions, compromises to the way people conventionally understand a story so they can have a greater reach? And what I mean by that is, if you start out with something that too much information that people don't know, they may get confused right away, they may get lost, they may not find a point of identification in your story. And so meeting people where they are, understanding what kinds of stories they bring to the table when they go to read your book or watch your film or see your Instagram reels, kind of requires you to have a sense of, okay, what are the conventions in play that I'm working with? And I'm always reminded of a little tribute to Martin Scorsese that I saw on TV 25 years ago or so. And it was Steven Spielberg talking about how he wanted to remake the old film Cape Fear, and he wanted Martin Scorsese to direct it. And Scorsese, who was kind of known as a kind of tough, uncompromising, realist filmmaker, said, I watched the old version, and I think I could do something with it, but, that story was about a perfect family threatened from the outside by a villain. What I want is a troubled family, a complicated family, a family that's got its own internal dissension that makes them vulnerable to the villain from the outside. And Spielberg said, well, you're Martin Scorsese, it'll be a great film and I love you, but that's going to cost us 40% of the gross. Right?
Yeah.
And so there's the question,
Yeah.
which is when do you feel like you might need to soften or compromise the kinds of story you might tell to other academics when you're speaking to a broader public who wants a certain kind of story about, for example, the American Revolution?
You can't. I can't. As those of you who have been with me knows that I am constitutionally incapable. In the end, when you need to act within the public history context, you're acting with a narrative, it is entirely, as Vince pointed out, the whole game, the whole challenge, the whole discipline is in the choices that you make. What you leave in, what you put in, what you leave out, what you accentuate, what you diminish, but we all still have to abide by we have to play by our rules as historians. You can't invent. You have to go with what the evidence will support, and not just reasonably support, but will support in a way that your audience will be able to understand and follow on their own. And so you've got to make these choices, and which makes the job of a public historian really hard, because you don't have the leeway, you don't have the liberty of somebody who just works in narrative, and you can invent because you have to fit it into the narrative structure, because that's how people's minds work. That's how they understand things. That's why conflict works in order to sell something, right? You can invent conflict. You can find those points in which that moment of drama will go ahead and be there. You can invent that. We don't have that luxury. We actually have to see things where they are and make those choices about that. In the end comes down to how relevant it is to the story that we want to tell, but always coming back to the requirements of our discipline. What can the evidence support, even as you're going through the process of this dual responsibility of abiding by the rules of narrative design? If we want to make sure that we're getting these stories and we're using them in film or we're using them in digital media, that we're able to go ahead and put that into the format, that requires a lot of choice making all the way through. It's entirely about choices. And the measure of your skill as a public historian is based upon how you are making those choices. Because it can't be to serve the narrative. It's got to be to serve the history, and the narrative choices have to be in service of that history. But the minute that you start making the choices where the narrative has to drive it, then you step outside of what we're doing. And that's where the rubber meets the road for me.
So because we are commemorating the 250th anniversary of the United States, there's a lot of storytelling going around. There's a lot of narrative. And people are making choices about what stories they want to tell, what stories they think are important, what stories you need to hear. And I have a question to you about your choices. Why isn't Ona Judge on the dollar bill?
There we go, right? Why isn't Ona Judge?
And why did you decide that instead of writing your story of the American Revolutionary War with George Washington as the principal hero, you were going to choose someone else? Could you tell us about Ona Judge, who she is, and how she features in your understanding of the revolution and its lessons for us?
Yeah, that's a good question. We're going to be here all night. This is the fun part for understanding the American Revolution. How revolutionary was it? What's the function of it? Revolutionary for who? World turns upside down? For who? A war for independence? For who? And I'm not just sort of that to be problematic in an audience. Answer the question. For who? I saw a T-shirt yesterday that was 250 years of liberty. For who? So if we want to say 250 years of white liberty, of white male liberty, let's not use that in terms of our framing and our storytelling. For who? And so when we think about Ona, a one-woman resistance wrecking machine, Ona Judge, when you think about what the revolution is supposed to be about in terms of our story, and this is the difference between the scholarship and what our public history is, of our broader public knowledge is of the revolution. In terms of the scholarship, I'm not saying anything new in this book. In terms of where Atlantic history has gotten us, in terms of where the scholarship has gotten us, that scholars are not necessarily writing checks that the history can't cash in terms of understanding what is the actual valence of the American Revolution, what it does, what it doesn't do, what the Declaration of Independence really functions as, how it works within the broader Atlantic world. We have an understanding about who that revolution, who independence was for. In terms of our scholarly conversation, it's a yawning gap between that and where most people think the revolution was. And so, but in that gap is about these power structures that Ona represents. If you get to where she is in Philadelphia in the early 1790s, and how this story that we tell, about the American Revolution, which it was always about independence, everybody who died before July 4th, 1776 in Quebec or at Bunker Hill, that was all in favor of it, that was all to forward independence. That independence is the natural progression of it, and the natural progression of what we were achieving independence for is resulting in the Constitution. That is one whole story we tell, and generally we tell it in a way that involves the same exact people. Forget that Samuel Adams was opposed to the Constitution to a certain extent. Forget that. That's a complication. However, when we see it through Ona's eyes, we get to see function. We get to see actually how power is mattering in the moment for a war for independence. Who is it independent for? What do you have to do with that? When she sees in the early 1790s in Philadelphia, not just that she is within the authority in the same way of the most powerful white man in America, the most powerful white man in America, but that now, what has changed for Ona And this tells you a lot about how revolutionary it was. What has changed for Ona is that George Washington in 1776 didn't have the power of an entire federal government at his beck and call to deploy it to load that weapon and aim it at her. He couldn't have done that with the British Empire. He did now. The Constitution had a fugitive slave clause. And then they passed the Fugitive Slave Act that he signs. So she not only has to act against him, she has to act against that, understanding where that is. And so when I think about Ona and about all these choices and about what she represents in terms of not just resistance, it's one thing to go ahead and understand resistance dynamics universally, right? Ways that that we can talk about resistance in 1944 France or 1961 Vietnam. We can understand resistance dynamics. But resistance operates in a particular way in the United States, given our political culture and our political structures. Ona represents that. She not only has to fight against George Washington, she not only has to fight against the new Constitution, she has to fight against a whole level of assumptions that are operating against her.
Let me follow up on that, because it's such a powerful story of this enslaved woman who ran away from George Washington and was never caught, right? Managed to maintain her freedom, right? Through her implacable resistance and resilience. It seems like a story we all ought to know. It seems like she ought to be someone on the money, right? It seems like it ought to be a story that we celebrate whenever we celebrate the United States. Why don't we? Why is that not a story that everybody knows, that like the story of George Washington and the wooden teeth or the cherry tree?
The phrase that I keep enforcing on my students, the question that I keep making them ask is, what work is this doing? And again, it's a question of functionality, but what work is this story doing? What work is the suppression of a story doing? Whose interests are being served by, once you identify what's going on, should I identify the suppression of a story or the exclusion of a story? Or we talked about choices like we did a second ago. Why certain things are being highlighted, why certain things are being excluded. Once you see that happening, who is that serving, what is that serving? If you highlight Ona, and you highlight the agency of that individual in her moment against any kind of abuse of authority, but the greatest abuse of authority, if you highlight not just her agency, but about what her example represents in her nature of resistance. She can't do it alone. We could tell the story where it's just one person. It takes her courage to set a spark, but she has to step outside of that house in Philadelphia into hands willing to take her. Hands who understand what they're getting into. Hands who understand that under the Fugitive Slave Act, they are federal felons with every single count every single day. And they have to pass her off to somebody on a boat who's going to get her up to New England. And they can pass her into somebody who ends up in Portsmouth. And those hands have to continue to sustain her while she persists in her own courage and vision. When you see that all of this can happen based upon nothing that the people at the top tells you what you're allowed to do. They're determining that. They are renegotiating that in the moment. If that is your lesson about American history, you get to negotiate what these words mean. You get to go ahead and identify your allies. You get to lean in on that. You don't have to wait to operate it through permitted channels to have somebody else tell you what you're allowed to be or do. Ona says, fuck you. Sorry. I get to decide that, but not just me. I get to have, my resistance is about a set of community values that isn't determined by a whole bunch of guys in clean shirts at the top. We're going to decide what our community values are going to be, and we're going to act on those community values despite what the legal structure, the constitutional structure, the cultural structure says they should be. We're going to define them for ourselves, and we're going to act on them. And that, to me, if that is our lesson, that we don't have to abide by what other people are saying we should act in, we can decide that. That's a much different kind of level of agency and citizenship and abiding by, like Sarah Joy's, abiding by your American values. It's not just about saying you have these values, trust me, I will act in them. It's about showing your work. Do you have these values? Are you going to act in them? And I think that's where we are.
I want to bring in one other character that you talk about in the book, and he's pivotal. You don't ignore the guys in the clean shirts at the top in this book, but you tell the story of James Madison, who I learned in school is the architect of the Constitution. And we all read Federalist 10 in college and think of that as a brilliant design for Republican government. But you get deeper into the story of James Madison, and he doesn't emerge really as the architect of government, but as you call him, a forced founder.
Yeah.
Would you talk a little bit about how you decided to tell that story of James Madison, the unfamiliar story of James Madison, who didn't give us the Bill of Rights, but was forced into including the Bill of Rights in the Constitution?
It all starts with my favorite story of resistance that never made it into the book. Having a deep understanding of little Jemmy in his moment. When he was in Williamsburg in 1778, he lost his hat. Staying on Duke Gloucester Street at one of the taverns, he lost his hat. And so he wouldn't go outside of his room, though, without a hat. How many people have been to Williamsburg? Duke Gloucester Street, not a long street. You know where the Capitol is. He would not leave his room to go to the Capitol without his hat. And so he sent his enslaved valet, here's where we get into the resistance, that's why I love this story, to go find him a hat. Goes out, comes back, couldn't find your hat, sorry. So little Jemmy doesn't go out that day. The next day, go out and find me a hat. Goes out looking for a hat, comes back, no hats in Williamsburg, they're all off to the they're off to the army. There are no hats. Little Jemmy can't go out. Day 2 in the summer in Williamsburg. Capitol building's just 450 yards away, can't go out. The next day, he sends him out. He finally comes back with a hat, but the hat's too big for. We have this from James Madison's own letters, by the way, so this is not somebody else's. This is what James Madison's writing to his father explaining this story. He comes back with a hat that's too big for James Madison. James Madison's only 5'2", something like that. So he comes back with a hat that's too big for him. So Madison has this choice. Does he go out looking like an idiot in a hat that's too big for him, or does he stay in and he waits? No, he goes out and he wears a hat. Now, he's not infusing this with the kind of resistance vibe that I am. I am seeing this as an act of overt resistance. There are hats in Williamsburg. So it was that story that sort of unlocked James Madison for me and made me kind of pissed off about it. But this idea that again, in the stories that we choose to tell, of inflating him as not just being the father of the Constitution with whatever those words are doing, but as the father of the Bill of Rights. A Bill of Rights that he didn't want to adopt, that he didn't think was necessary. Now, we can talk about the scholarship about why he didn't think was necessary, but the fact is still there. This was something that he did not want to abide by. And to understand how he was pushed into it is not just a story about how, more broadly speaking, we tell our stories about who gets to do what in American history, but also how change comes about. It's almost about a theory of change. Does a theory of change come from people who are infused with great ideas, who then act on those ideas? And we have a great system that will enable people to do that. So the system is fundamentally good. It operates to produce positive outcomes. As long as people have these ideas in their mind that they can deploy through these functional institutions. Or is our theory of change, no, those institutions are functioning to actually establish power and to maintain it in the service of this group, and that the only way to change it is to fight against it, is to expand it. And then the story of the Bill of Rights does that. And it does it in a fundamental way. The Bill of Rights is fundamental to our understanding of what America is and should be. And if it was a product of the people who wanted to force it in against people who didn't want it there, I think that spins our entire concept, our entire theory of what change requires in America on top of it. And so that's, with Madison, the haunted man of Maiden Lane, he's driven crazy by Patrick Henry, driven insane by Patrick Henry. And although Patrick Henry's got his problems, in that moment, I love Patrick Henry because he was driving James Madison crazy. But to the point where he was willing to go ahead and assume the leading role of pushing through the Bill of Rights so that he could do what? So that he could maintain his place in the government that he had created. Because Henry had done such a good job of keeping him out of it. He kept him out of the Senate, and he was about to keep him out of the House. But Madison, because of his ego, wanted to be a part of this government. And so he adapted his goals to that. And I think that when we look at that dynamic, it's an interesting both point in the micro, but also in the macro.
There are lots more stories like that that really cast the revolution in a new light and its aftermath with that theory of power in mind, that these institutions function to preserve the power of the people who create them, and they only transform by virtue of the resistance of people who are arrayed against them. And then you offer us a kind of toolkit. There are lots of inspiring stories in this book, but you say explicitly that your purpose here is not inspiration, but instruction. And you want to offer us some principles for thinking about the way power works and how to resist it effectively that we can use in our own time. I'd like you to talk a little bit about those, and maybe we can bring Sarah into the conversation as well.
Yeah, Sarah represents so much of this. And this is the difference between the book that I thought I was going to write and the book that I ended up writing. The history's nice. I think it's nice. There are some great stories in there and things that I think situate our understanding of the past and how it works differently. I think what actually turned it into a different book was how to think about that practically, how to kind of draw actual lessons from these moments that people could see today. I mean, obviously, public historians were always thinking about, because we have to go where people are, how do the stories we're telling about the past matter in their lives? Sort of relevance is a word that gets thrown all around all the time for us. But this is about how does it impact you? How does it matter to you? How is it, for me, how is it usable to you? Not just interesting, but how can you, in fact, deploy it to help you understand the world around you better so that you can do something about it? And that's kind of where the principles come from, and in a way that was one of the hardest parts of the book, because I had to do a lot of work on understanding broader resistance dynamics and how they work, and then and not just say, well, this is a nice story that I can make represent this principle. That's not fair to you, right? If this is about real people in real moments against real challenges, then shoehorning a story into making it represent something that I think actually can relate doesn't do you any good if you can rely on it. You can't see yourself in that. You can't rely on that. And so I really had to try to do the hard work. I mean, for me, it was hard work of making sure that it was authentic, that it was reliable, that I was showing you an orange and telling you it was an orange. I wasn't showing you it was an orange and telling you it was an apple, right? And so that was very important to me, because otherwise, in the end, public history is no good for anybody if you can't use it in your life. It is not if these moments aren't legible to you. And so that's where the principles came from, that I really had to see that in this moment. And now a lot of these things, Ona's the greatest example, but they represent so many of the other principles that are in there, so many of these other resistance dynamics. You can see that. So it's not just one, but that one really has to be in there and really sort of screaming loud, especially because for some of them, these are resistance principles that are not universal. You can't apply them to France in 1944. You can't apply them to Hungary in 2026. There are challenges in America that operate against resistance that we have to understand how they function. And so I needed to make sure that we were able to identify and explore them, or else it doesn't work. And that's where Sarah comes in.
I don't know if you wanted to add to that, Sarah, but your work in many ways exemplifies the kinds of practices that Tad is talking about in this book. A lot of what he does here, and forgive me if I'm if I'm taking you back to your, so forgive me if I'm taking you back to your military reconnaissance days, is you're encouraging us to observe, orient, decide, and act, right? That it's only in really telling these stories in, as you say, an honest way, in an observational way, where we understand the details, that we can orient ourselves, see the patterns that are playing out again and again in history. Not that history is repeating itself, but that there are patterns in the way that power works that we can learn to observe. And that helps us decide what we're going to do. And then we have to act. And I think that's where you come in, which is thinking about how it is that we use the information that we gather from our readings of history, from our observations of society, from our conversations with friends, and then make real decisions, take real actions that are going to make a difference. And I wonder if you just talk about that a little bit.
Yes. Hello, everybody. My name is Sarah George. I'm really, really thrilled to be here. Just as a little bit of a way of background, I am an elected prosecutor in Burlington, Vermont, which in most jurisdictions is called a district attorney. Similar in Boston, it's a district attorney, but I'm a state's attorney up there. And what I have done since the very first time I was elected was to talk about the legal system very honestly, which is not the typical narrative coming from an elected prosecutor, which has come with a lot of pushback. For example, I have been very clear since day one of my tenure as an elected official that our legal system is not broken, and much like is outlined in the book, is actually working exactly as it was designed, which is to police, incarcerate, and prosecute people of color and people who are dealing with substance use issues, mental health issues, poor people. It is designed to oppress people and to uplift racial and class order, which public defenders have been saying for years, right? But prosecutors don't typically say it. And the reason that I say it and I don't shy away from it is because I think it's really important that we are clear about the history of our legal system in order to try to actually fix it. And again, when I say fix it, I mean like dismantle it and rebuild it in a way that is actually fair for the people that it serves, which is... But when you resist against a system, the system resists back very powerfully and very vocally. And so as an elected official saying those things, it is important that we really do make sure our values are clear and make sure that, that the community that you serve and the community that will be voting for you knows exactly where you stand on these issues, so that when you are elected and re-elected, which I'm grateful to be, it is very clear how those values are going to guide your decisions, and that when you have opportunities to prove it, that you do act on it, even in the face of a lot of pushback and a lot of people who would really like for the system to stay the way it is, to serve the same people that it has served for 200 years, and to make sure that the hierarchy is preserved. And I've been unfortunate to have those opportunities in some ways to prove that, but very much in the last year. I mean, really, over the last 9 years in this position, I've had a lot of opportunities to prove it, but in the last year especially, our federal government is giving us plenty of opportunities to prove our values, and it's been easy in some ways to stand up for those values when you're elected on them, but it does come with a lot of pushback.
Can I ask you a specific question about like the political negotiations and maneuvers you have to go through to continue to espouse those values and to enact them? One of Tad's principles in this toolkit is about my enemy's enemy, acknowledging that your allies, where you find them, don't have to be pure. And I guess I'd like you to speak a little bit about, impure allies that you've had. You don't have to name names. Impure allies that you've had where you felt like in order to enact your principles, you had to negotiate with some people, I don't know if compromise is the right word, but find a way to make common cause with people who had intentions that were different than yours, and where you thought that maybe you could make common cause on something even while understanding that they had different intentions than you. Do you have any experiences like that?
Wow, that's a tough question. I mean, I certainly, I think the most obvious answer to that is probably law enforcement. I mean, I would not be able to do my job if I didn't have a relationship with law enforcement. And so I am constantly collaborating with law enforcement and having conversations with law enforcement about these issues and about cases that we're working on together, while also being very public and acknowledging the history of law enforcement and the sort of evolution of law enforcement and why it's so problematic the way that it was designed and the way that it has been implemented and the authority that law enforcement continue to exert in our communities. And that does not always work. I mean, we very, it has very publicly been a conflict in the past. It presently in some ways is still a conflict, but we work together every day. We have to in order to keep our communities safe. And that's, I think, a balance that I'm working on every day, is just figuring out how to work with law enforcement to keep our communities safe. Yeah, I think that's the most common example I can think of.
That's great. I wanted to bring Kahlil in the conversation for a minute and ask you, as a young historian, a public historian, a more public historian than me, and maybe a more public historian than Dr. Stoermer, kind of how it is that you think of the relationship between the public history that you do and the academic history that unks like me might write.
Thank you for the question. Hi, everyone. My name is Kahlil. I'm very honored to be up here with you guys, such wise, knowledgeable people. And I look up to the unks, to answer your question. So I have a bit of formal training. I have an undergrad. I graduated from Yale University, so welcome. Yeah. And I studied history there, but I definitely realized that a lot of the work that professors do in academia never reaches the average person who might be even interested in this history. It definitely does not reach the average young person who might grow up and have no interest, or at least no direct interest in history, but at the same time is being definitely influenced to have certain perspectives about the world. So I don't know what you guys think about Gen Z, but oftentimes when I'm interacting with older people, a lot of their understanding of my generation is frozen in the sort of 2017 to 2020 period, at the time where people really thought that Gen Z was going to save the world, that we had the Greta Thunbergs, we had March for Our Lives, which is protesting against gun violence, and there was a lot of progressive energy within my generation. All of that is not gone, but it's heavily subdued. So right now what you see, the data shows that most young men, most Gen Z young men supported Donald Trump and the Republican Party in the last election. That number is only growing. So there's definitely a polarization amongst young people, amongst Gen Zers, and a lot of the opinions that young men or young people have in general, they're getting it from these, frankly, like idiotic sources, those being Donald Trump as the president, but also podcasts. So many of you may have heard of a person named Joe Rogan or Theo Vaughn. These are a lot of far-right conservative voices who will spend hours talking about the idea of America, about modern-day politics, about what's currently in pop culture, in the news, and of course history, without being challenged, and in many ways being platformed by the most powerful people, the most powerful institutions, and the most powerful apps like TikTok and Facebook, which have very much aligned themselves with the far right. So what I do, and what I've been doing for the past 5 years, is I make videos about history on social media for a young audience, taught in a very progressive way that I think is more accurate to the history of what people should know. And a part of that is making sure that I'm able to simplify and really make entertaining what some of my professors have researched. So my first ever TikTok video was actually based off of the research of Beverly Gage, who's one of my history professors. She was researching the FBI and COINTELPRO, and she had rediscovered a letter that the FBI had sent to Martin Luther King Jr. in order to coerce him into committing suicide because they were that against his activism. But that was a story that most people in my generation, that I personally had never heard of, and my first ever video on social media got 1.3 million views in just an hour. Thank you. And to wrap up, that showed me that once again, if you make these intellectual and these academic research topics and papers, if you make them interesting enough for young people, if you turn them into a story, if you highlight what's most engaging about them, and then use that as a lesson, because I didn't just highlight the sensational aspect of the FBI trying to kill MLK, I also talked about resistance and how resistance matches resistance from people in power, and the importance of knowing the real story of American history. And these were all lessons that I was able to almost Trojan horse into a very riveting 1-minute video. So what I have to do is turn some of the more rigorous intellectual work into something that's consumable and digestible for young people, and compete against all of these nefarious actors who are trying to influence them with mis and disinformation.
There you go. There you go. There you go. You know, let me say, yesterday morning, Kahlil and I were filming some stuff, and he said, okay, well, you know, summarize these things that are in your book, and we'll go ahead and film them. And I stood up and I did, and he was like, don't do it like that. Do it like this.
We're going to lose 40% of the gross.
and he was right. And so, Gen Z, you go.
So I think we have plenty of time for questions if anybody has them.
And just to format the questions, I'll be going around and doing it Oprah style, as I was told. Yeah, I've never watched Oprah on my TV. I've seen clips on TikTok, so I'll try my best.
On the Wayback Machine. Oprah's in the Wayback Machine now.
In all fairness, Vince first reached for Phil Donahue. So.
Hi folks, my name's Patrick. I'm a high school history teacher, and every year I want to ask you a question about the psychology of history.
Yeah.
And every year, at the beginning of the year, I start off with a unit on history and memory, and sort of why we tell the stories that we do, et cetera, who gets to choose these stories. And one of the things that I do is I give my students an anonymous survey, and I ask them, on a range of kind of questions, what the purpose of history should be. And universally every year, the overwhelming answer is that history should challenge us. History should be that doesn't shy away from the ugly stuff. And I think if we give that survey to Americans generally, we would see similar results. So my question then would be, why then do we see such resistance coming in the other direction to those sorts of history, challenging histories? Is it really just that the people with their hands on the levers of power are kind of manipulating this, or is it that people want history to be challenging, but they want it to be challenging people who disagree with that?
I think Sarah should start, actually. No, honestly, because this is something you actually do in a positive way. I mean, I've heard you talk about the way history has informed your values, and that this is not about a history that necessarily has to be uncomfortable. I mean, this is about a history that can actually inform action. So you have history inform your stuff all the time. And so how does that work for you?
Yeah, it does. But I feel like similar to sort of baked into your question is that when I highlight the 200 years of research that shows that what we're doing in our legal system is not working, if what we want is safety, that we have the highest incarceration rate in the world, and we're one of the least safe countries, right?
I teach a law course too.
Okay, but what I find all the time is that when you show, we have all of this stuff that's not working, we have years and years and years and years of research that shows that what we're doing isn't working, and I implement one policy that goes against that, or to show that, everybody wants to know how I'm proving that my policy is working, right? And that's every single question. How do you know this is working? What are you doing to show that this is working? Well, what are you doing to show that what we're doing is working? Because we actually know it's not. And what that tells me is that people don't actually want to know what is or isn't working. They want to maintain control, power, and money, right? And if you stop incarcerating people, a lot of people are losing a lot of money. And so I think that it all comes back, like every story that we are telling people is to maintain those three things: the power, control, and money. I don't have an answer. I don't know if there's.
And my quick answer, and Kahlil's got some sharp ideas about this, is that we have to ask about, well, what do we mean by uncomfortable and why, right? Is it uncomfortable because it runs at odds against some deep-seated notion people have about themselves, and because of that kind of internal conflict, that is what causes the discomfort. And so what we're just trying to do is to just kind of lay out, well, this is actually the way things happened. And the space in between it that causes discomfort is the thing we need to interrogate more. What is in fact driving the discomfort? Because my discomfort and Sarah's discomfort and Vince's discomfort and Kahlil's discomfort might actually be 4 different questions. And so it's actually to sort of like try to focus on what do we mean by that, and how do we unpack that, because the answer to that question could actually yield to a lot of interesting conclusions.
Yeah, and I'm gonna just really quickly respond. I think the second thing that you posed was a part of the answer, and that's what the idea that everyone thinks a challenging history or history that challenges the beliefs is a different thing, right? So for me, I make content around how, like someone like Ona Judge, for example, how our founding fathers were not the greatest people in the world, how they were slave owners and they knew slavery was wrong. And for my audience, that is a challenging history. That is something that sort of scratches that itch that they have. But I also follow a lot of conservative accounts and a lot of far-right people, and their version of a challenging history is very different. Theirs is, oh, these woke people are trying to make it seem like the founding fathers are so evil, look how good they actually were. Or they're trying to say that Christopher Columbus didn't discover America and he was a tyrant, but actually he did these great things for the Indians. Like, that's something they would actually say. And this is something like you see this all the time in history, right? Like the Civil War is a good example. If you go to the South, especially you talk to organizations like the Daughters of the, what's it called? Yeah, exactly. Like their whole thing was that you're lied to. Like the South wasn't that bad. We treated our slaves very nicely. We weren't fighting for slavery. We were fighting for states' rights. I think every group of people in America has a different battle in their heads. So what we might think is actually a story that reinforces the status quo, a la the founding fathers are good, many people think that that's actually fighting against us in this narrative that everything was horrible and America is too woke or something like that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think one of the problems at the root of this issue in your question is people want history to instill pride, right? And they reject histories that make them feel ashamed. If you look at even kind of Donald Trump's executive orders on the teaching of history in K through 12 classes, he thinks historians should be telling stories that instill pride, patriotic pride in the nation. And this is not just nationalists. This is a lot of people. Like they want, my people's history to give me pride. And we don't want to hear the stories that might make us ashamed. This is our family history. This is genealogy. We all want to be connected to some important person or some king, right? Not the person in the kitchen that king might have, had progeny with. So there's an element of that I think kind of runs across the political spectrum, where people would much rather hear stories that make them proud than stories that make them feel ashamed, those uncomfortable stories. And what I try to do as a historian is try to think more about processes of transformation, how it is that things change over time with a number of people who we can be proud of some things that they did and ashamed of other things they did. And we can recognize in most historical figures, right, that complexity. People have actions they take actions that you think are great, and almost everybody that you could name is compromised, has failings. I think that's a mature and honest way to think about history, that we don't just have to go combing through the past looking for heroes and villains, but looking for the way in which these dynamics play out with heroic actions, virtuous actions, compromised actions, evil, all of which playing out over time. And that, I think, gives us a real human story that's not a kind of story of national pride or people's pride or even pride in the resistance, right? But a story that makes everybody uncomfortable at various times and at various points. And I just think that any story that doesn't make anybody uncomfortable at some point is not really worth telling.
So yeah, well, first of all, Tad insisted that I mention that I wrote a book. Ask me questions, you mentioned wrote a book. So I wrote a book called Feed the People, which is a history of women's citizenship in the U.S. And I do talk about
Jen, tell people who you are.
I'm Jen Henrik. And I wrote a book called Feed the People, and I have copies of it in my car.
There you go. I am happy now. Thank you.
I also used to live next door to Vince. That's another side. For including information about me. And I write about the United Daughters of the Confederacy in my book.
Boo!
That's a complication in women's history, particularly white women's history, right? Because they're largely responsible for the spread of the lost cause narrative around the country, because they were women and they could focus on the schools and the children, what the children learned, and they did really evil stuff because they could. My question for you, Tad, is as you know, I'm a white person.
Are you?
I'm a white person.
Say it ain't so. Thanks, Jen.
And you're a white guy.
I am.
And so when I was writing my book, I initially started referring all the women in it by their first names.
Yeah.
And which was great until I got to like Harriet Tubman or Rosa Parks, and I'm like, I can't call Harriet Tubman Harriet.
Yeah.
As a white woman, like I can't do that. And so I had to adjust it, go back and do all that stuff. What were ways that you checked yourself to make sure that you were being responsible as a white guy telling a lot of these histories?
Yeah.
You didn't call James Madison Little Jimmy in the book.
Little Jimmy, I do.
Yeah.
Before you answer, I'm going to just ping you to talk about metacopy and the metacopy.
Oh, well, because it flows. Jen's question flows all the way through the book, making again, it's about the choices that we make and recognizing whose story is this to tell, and what is my responsibility for representing that authentically. And like so for the chapter with Metacomet, Metacomet has 5 indigenous names, 6 indigenous names. The one thing we can't call him is King Philip, right? I mean, it's about making sure that my principle is always to be as respectful as I can of that person in their moment, but also know where I can't go. That no matter how I try to be empathetic, I can't be, and I have to recognize that my privilege getting me nowhere near that experience, and I cannot assume that it does. And so it happened with Metacomet, trying to understand throughout that entire chapter, making sure that we were getting the name right enough, right, and that in terms of being respectful to the people whose story it was, and that I was making sure that I was consulting with people whose story it was. Being very clear, it can't be my story, and that my responsibility in representing that story authentically. But if I can talk about Little Jimmy, yeah, I can represent that just fine, right? But like, it really hit me with Nancy Dixon. That chapter, they're all important to me. That chapter is probably the most important to me. The chapter of this 27-year-old woman and her 3-year-old daughter and what it is she's doing in that moment to navigate her world. But I can't access that, and I can't pretend to access that. And so I had to be, and this isn't about naming choices, but it was about the toughest part of that was, it's a very simple question as a historical matter, but it was about determining when she left, when she ran. It might sound like a small issue, but in the Book of Negroes, she is standing in front of the clerk and she has to report when she left, and she says 3 years ago. This is November of 1783 when she's getting on the boat in New York to go to the Bahamas. She says 3 years ago. Now, historians, a whole bunch of other people who've done this interpretation, just kind of blow that away and say, 1781 kind of later. But the thing is that for me, it was No, damn it, Nancy Dixon said 3 years ago. Nancy Dixon meant 3 years ago. I can't for a second sit there, because the problem is, for you to run to the British, there has to be a British for you to run to. There are no British anywhere near Williamsburg 3 years in November or the fall of 1780. None. And that changes the story. If she's taking off 3 years before, it changes the dynamic about what she's doing with a 3-year-old. I can't get my 3-year-old down the steps, much less to Portsmouth, hundreds of miles away. I mean, I don't mean to be glib about that, but you think about the responsibility you have for your child, that you're just going to take off. And so it changes the story. So to me, it was at every single moment, I have to respect her. I have to respect her in her moment. I have to respect her as a mom. I have to respect her as a black woman. I have to respect her as an enslaved woman. I have to respect that. But in respecting that, I have to recognize where I can't go. And then who I have to lean on and what I have to lean on. So I sent that chapter to a lot of friends and colleagues who actually work on this, who are black historians who work on the enslaved, about help me here. Make sure that it's because I have to recognize where I can't check myself, and lean into the people who can. And so that's what I do, and I try to do that. I try to do that at every stage. But it's Nancy that, damn it, I was not going to get her wrong. I was not going to get Metacomet wrong. But Nancy, I am not getting a black woman wrong. I am not doing that. I am not doing that. I am not doing that. And that meant the world to me, just to kind of make sure I was making those choices. I'm not quite sure I made the right ones. But what I had to do every single point was privilege her perspective against all comers. I don't care whether or not I had to kind of shoehorn, well, the British were in, the British were not. No, let's talk about that as a historical matter in terms of the analysis, but privilege her at every point, because it's her story that's been screwed by historians for 250 years. Now I'm going to take her word for it, and that's got to be enough. So I hope that answers the question.
I think we just have time for one more question. Is that the signal I'm getting? Okay.
No pressure.
You mentioned like following a lot of right-wing like podcasters and historians. How do you feel about the audiences that you have reached, and has it given you any hope about breaking both in and out of algorithms and echo chambers to reach a wider audience?
Great question.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Let's give you a round of applause for the question directly towards me. Yeah, so as I mentioned, I do follow a lot of conservative and far-right accounts, which means every once in a while I get a DM or direct message from my followers saying, oh my God, like, why do you follow this person? Are you in the KKK or something? I'm like, no, I'm not, but I think it's very important to break echo chambers. And I also think that as a public historian, what you have to do is understand what other people are saying and what other people are telling their audiences in order to understand better your own beliefs. And there's even times where I've followed a conservative historian and I've learned something, like at a factual level. I might not agree with their interpretation, but at the factual level, there is knowledge that everyone has that you don't. So there's always something to learn from people, even if they're on the other side. I will say for myself as a content creator, it is very hard to reach audiences that don't already agree with you. And the platforms are set up that way. TikTok and Instagram and Facebook, they're all set up so that people who are following you or people who already agree with you, that it's staying in the echo chamber and that's something that they will like. The way that I try to address this is by making content about topics that are widely already discussed. So one example is, does everyone know who Bad Bunny is? If you saw the Super Bowl this year? Yeah. So Bad Bunny, he's a reggaeton artist, right? He's not necessarily associated with history, but in his new album, which is heavily about the history of Puerto Rico, he has a song called Lo que le pasó a Hawaii. What that translates to is what happened to Hawaii. So a general audience of young people loves Bad Bunny. At any club that you go to, they play Bad Bunny. However, they don't necessarily know what that song means or why a Puerto Rican artist would make a song called What Happened to Hawaii. The reality is that that song is Bad Bunny it's almost like a lullaby, and it's a plea to Puerto Rico saying that he does not want what happened to Hawaii to happen to Puerto Rico. So what happened to Hawaii? Well, that was a video that I made and I posted on TikTok, and that got millions and millions of views. And in that video, I talked about how the American government, starting in Boston actually, sending out missionaries from Boston, overthrew the sovereign kingdom of Hawaii, took the island and made it a state forcibly against the indigenous peoples. So that's one way that I try to incorporate pop culture and moments and news into my work to try to reach a broader audience. There's an app called, there's a newsletter platform. So one of them is Substack, which has some issues, but that does not operate based on an algorithm. So if someone subscribes to me on Substack, which is a newsletter, they will automatically get anything that I post. So what I try to say is for every content creator who wants to be in this game for a very long time, try to get people into a newsletter platform or somewhere where you can own your audience. And that way you don't have to worry about TikTok or Facebook muting you or only showing you to a sub portion of it. In case anyone's interested, that Substack is called History Can't Hide. So feel free to follow. Thank you. I think we get one more.
One more question.
Oh, sure.
Back. Yeah, thank you.
There you go. Feel free to say your name a little bit.
My name's Aaron. I live an hour south of town. So when I started following Tad about a year ago, it had been after probably 5 years of deconstructing my own life. And you know, we talked about having a story, the narrative, right? And so I guess I kind of went through a crisis, you know, because I'm reading Michelle Alexander and, you know, and finding all this stuff that I had been taught as a young man to be completely false and just propaganda in this whole narrative. So when you start talking about these stories, right, and you bring them, you know, you asked a question about like how did you determine what stories to bring in? Really, where I'm at right now is I'm so frustrated and like I'm only into to throw right now in the book. So you talked about up to this point though is operating within the system, without the system, and I've been terribly frustrated over the last year. I mean, more so than I was 5 years previous. And so, okay, we have this discussion. What the hell do we do?
Yeah. 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 Well, what's your name?
Aaron.
Aaron. Thanks. And I appreciate the deconstruction because that's what this discussion's about. I mean, functionally, it's what it's about.
Right.
But you're about to get into the good stuff, so keep reading. Well, because hold on. What is going on in the moment that you're into in the book by the 1840s and 1850s are people asking the same question that you're asking. What do we do? It doesn't seem like we can act. It seems like these pathways are closed. It seems claustrophobic, and that we are being told that things might work out, that if we're patient, if Daniel Webster says it, then it's okay. So all these people who you trust are reinforcing a system that is actually not showing you results. And so that is essentially where that part of American history goes, is that you already have people who know that system is not working. You have enslaved people, you have the black abolitionists, you have the black resistance that are already doing that. And so you have to sort of understand that there are people who are in fact at the time spinning that, but the people who aren't are the white comfortable people who are stuck exactly where you are, and exactly where a lot of Americans are. And that is part of what I hope that the book kind of provides, is that you're able to kind of, not in real time, but that you're able to follow these people through their own deconstruction. They have to deconstruct their sense of their relationship to what's going on in their country. And then, because what that enables them to do, and sort of Sarah and I were talking about this earlier, what that enables them to do is see actually where the problem lies that you need to force the fight against. Now, Vince mentioned for Sarah that about my enemy's enemy, but what Sarah represents is not just carrying the moral weight, staying true to what you know to be true, even if people are going to swing against you, forcing the fight, going ahead and bringing what it is you can to bear at the point you can bring it, but also seize the moment, right? I mean, is that you've got to go ahead and bring it when you're expected to. But those lessons don't start getting applied at scale until people go through exactly what you're doing right now, deconstructing their identity, who they think they are. And that is when we talk about, you were talking about uncomfortable before, where I see so much of the discomfort for people whom I engage with online and certainly on the Make It Make Sense book tour, is that my who I thought I was as an American isn't who I am as an American. And that is the point that why I try to sort of lean into Thoreau, is that he's going through that too. And so many Americans were going through that at the time, that the Constitution isn't what you thought the Constitution was. These leaders that you thought were in fact representing those values that were saying they did weren't deploying those things in practice. And it is in that we see the problems that are being caused, so you got to drive at that. And so it is that process. So you're where you need to be. I mean, in that sense, I don't mean to be glib about that, but you're not alone in this. And in doing that is to kind of see, keep reading, because it is about, and it's about with so many people, our sense of self as it relates to our institutions and what the stories of our history has told us about how those institutions, what those institutions are supposed to represent, in terms of using our consent of the governed, isn't that. And once you start, but detaching from that isn't easy, and it's not quick. I mean, it took these folks a decade or more. And that's part of the conversation they have with a lot of folks about resistance dynamics now, is that people want this to happen quickly. It doesn't happen quickly ever, unless enslaved people happen very quickly. I call that, there's complex resistance, there is simple resistance. That's simple resistance. I mean, you understand what the abuse of authority is and your relationship to it. When we think about complex resistance, sort of an analytical part that didn't make it into the book for obvious reasons, complex resistance is when, and this is where it comes down to. Complex resistance is when the enemy is you. When you actually have to operate as resistance, and certainly at scale, you have to recognize an other. You have to recognize that there is an enemy that you're pushing against. And so when the abuse of authority emerges internally, rather than invades from outside, then you have to go through a process of disconnecting yourself from that. This is your family, these are your friends. Like, how do you determine who that other is that you need to push back against? That's what they're doing that's what they were doing in the 1760s and 1770s. That's what they're doing in the 1840s, 1850s. There has to be an other that you're willing to go ahead and engage in direct action against. And that is a tough road to hoe, and I'm not going to tell you it's not. But people did it, and they did it going through the same exact process that you're talking about now. So to the extent that there is something to fall back on, it is that not only are you not alone in this moment, you're not alone in its historical matter. People have done this, same thing, similar things, facing similar challenges. I hope that helps. But I'm not the kind of doctor, right? Dude, you know what I do, right? I'm not going to throw up the hope ball and just hope you swing at it, right? You get what I got.
Hi, I just want to say that a lot of the things you've spoken of resonate with me a lot as an anti-Zionist Jew who's been working for Palestinian liberation for a long time. Feeling like a Cassandra at this moment, saying, this is everything you've been warning about, and now it concerns the whole country. I've been wondering how people who aren't already activists can be motivated. Throughout history, have you seen it more as people being spurred by self-interest, or by political needs, or expediency, or what's been the most common thread? Is it indecency or self-interest?
We can all do this. Probably all do this quickly. We'll all have to. Well, but no. It's yes and yes and yes and yes and yes. It's all of these things, and that's why when we're talking about my enemy's enemy is that you have to see the point at which, who cares at a certain point whether or not somebody shares your particular intentions? Do they share your goals? Do they want to actually achieve what you're doing? So like what Sarah and I were talking about before too is, and what she kind of represents. You have to go down to the local level to really see where resistance can matter right now, and actually see where that kind of, we can call it coalition building, how that dynamic works, because right now people are expecting a kind of resistance to be deployed from the top down. Ain't happening. That's not how it works. It's not how it's ever worked. So when you're thinking about all of those, whether or not self-interest drives, yes, it does. Whether or not values drive it, sure it does. But you have to be in a position to be able to evaluate what, and that's why when I talk about why vision matters in resistance, you have to be willing to risk, but you have to have a very clearly articulated goal of what you want to risk for. Because then, at a functional level, you can determine who's on your side to that end and not. Right now, if you are, historically speaking, if you're vague, then you can't determine really who's on your side, other than by what words they're sharing. But if you talk about, here is the goal I want to achieve, then you can determine who's on your side and not give a crap about, in fact, what's driving them, to a point, as to what fights are okay for you to have after that goal is achieved. And that's about risk, it's about value judgment, it's about assessment. That's the hard work, but it's easier to do and better to do and more effective to do at a local level, where at a state's attorney race, this is where that rubber is meeting the road, right now, or at a congressional level race, in Colorado against Diggett, right? I mean, it's at that level. And so we look at it there, and all of these dynamics are what's playing out there. But that could be, those could be some very tough choices to make. Does that make sense, Lee?
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that especially, I was sworn in initially on January 20th of 2017, same day that Donald Trump was first sworn in as president. And as a queer woman, in Vermont, I was feeling incredibly overwhelmed. And I remember in that moment thinking that this was an opportunity to just focus locally and to bring a community together and share values and be really clear about what our values are, and sort of just like focusing on that and not worrying, frankly, trying not to worry as much about what was happening federally. We as a state started immediately to indoctrinate or change our constitution in Vermont to protect women's rights. We saw the writing on the wall nationally, and we focused locally and made stuff happen, and really came together as a community, not just a statewide community, but in my county. And I think that has allowed us to build momentum in a way that at least gives us some sense on a daily basis of having community and protecting each other.
Lots more like that in this book. If you haven't bought it already, please pick up your copy, Resistance History of the United States. Another round of applause for Tad, Sarah, Kahlil, and our host. Thank you all so much. Appreciate you.